Thanks, so welcome. This room was really cold about half an hour ago. Amazing what shared bodily warmth can do, isn't it? I'm absolutely certain we've broken every fire regulation, so I won't tell anyone if you don't. I'm sure you don't need to come to a Christian Union gathering like this one to know that suffering, the topic that we're considering today, is a universal human experience. Statistics tell us that over the past 30 years, 4,200 works have been published around the world on the theme of suffering. That works out at about 3 per week. 3 books per week are published around the world on the question of suffering. It's ever relevant and ever important to consider. And of course, many of you didn't need me to give you that statistic to tell you that suffering is a reality. For some of you here, some of us here, suffering is an awful personal reality. My guess is in a group this size, there will be some here at least for whom suffering is a very present reality. And so you're not so much, as one writer put it, asking questions from the armchair as the philosopher, but asking them from the wheelchair as it was in pain. It's a deeply personal question. Now, if that's you, it's possible that as we have to do some of the more philosophical stuff today, some of what I will say will be lost on you. Actually, you don't need my words as much as you need somebody to cry with. In times when I've suffered, I've been really encouraged and comforted by a very precious, ancient Bible verse, thousands of years old, where God looks at his suffering people and says this: "In their affliction, I too am afflicted." Amazing. It says that the one true God weeps with the sufferer. And so as those who this week are seeking to share our God's passions and desires, there are Christians here who want to listen to you if you're suffering. We may not be able to do very much, but it may be that actually talking with someone and crying with someone will be more helpful to you than hearing all of the words I have to say. That may be true of a few here, but my guess is that for the majority of us here, this is a bigger question. For the majority of us here, it would just seem like nonsense to bring God into the picture in a world of suffering and pain. Now, as a Christian, I think differently, and in fact, where I want us to see in the next 20 minutes, where I want us to end, is I want to suggest that the God of the Bible, revealed in human time and space in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, is, I believe, the only one who can bring any semblance of sense to a world of suffering and pain. But I realize that to many here, that statement is going to seem counterintuitive and senseless. Epicurus, of course, wrote what we see here on the screen. He famously wrote this: "Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then where does evil come from? And is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God?" Millennia later, the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche wrote, "Is man merely a mistake of God's, or is God merely a mistake of man?" And of course, more recently, in a high-profile video, QI presenter Stephen Fry has gone on record saying that he can't believe in a God whilst there is the existence of things like animal suffering and bone cancer in seriously ill children. Now, it may seem that the existence of suffering makes the existence of a good God nonsense, and many, many thinkers have ditched God in the name of the existence of suffering and pain. With the greatest of respect to these thinkers, though, I want to suggest this lunchtime that such a move is deeply problematic and misguided. In fact, getting rid of God from the question and existence of suffering makes everything worse, because in a godless universe, there is no comfort whatsoever to the sufferer. Suffering is rendered both natural and hopeless. Comfort is removed, and human suffering is normalized. The late, great Christopher Hitchens writes beautifully and chillingly on just this. He is honest enough to take the cancer that killed him into view. And he wrote this shortly before his death. Here is an extended quote from one of his articles called The Topic of Cancer. It says this: "In one way, I suppose, I have been in denial for some time, knowingly burning the candle at both ends and finding that it often gives a lovely light. But for precisely that reason, I can't see myself smiting my brow with shock or hear myself whining about how it's all so unfair. I have been taunting the reaper into taking a free scythe at my direction, and now I have succumbed to something so predictable and banal it bores even me. Rage would be beside the point for exactly the same reason. Instead, I am badly oppressed. I am badly oppressed by a gnawing sense of waste. I had plans for my next decade, and I felt I'd worked hard enough to earn it. Will I really not live to see my children married? To see the World Trade Center rise again, to read, if not write, the obituaries of elderly villains like Henry Kissinger and Joseph Ratzinger. But I understand this sort of non-thinking for what it is: sentimentality and self-pity. Of course, my book hit the bestseller list on the day that I received that grimmest of news bulletins. And for that matter, the last flight that I took as a healthy-feeling person to a fine big audience at the Chicago Book Fair was the very one that made me a million-miler on United Airlines, with a lifetime of free upgrades to look forward to. But, and here we are on the screen, irony is my business. And I just can't see any ironies here. Would it be less poignant to get cancer on the day that my memoirs were remaindered as a box office turkey, or that I was bounced from a coach class flight and left on the tarmac? To the dumb question, why me, the cosmos barely bothers to return the reply. Why not? Hitchens' famous fellow atheist, Richard Dawkins, famously put it like this in his book, River Out of Eden: "The universe, we observe, has precisely the properties we should exist if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference." And so, says Richard Dawkins, look at the world and see the suffering and know that nature is just red in tooth and claw. There is no purpose, no evil, no good. And so says Richard Dawkins, and so says Christopher Hitchens. No one should be outraged by suffering. When you're suffering, you can't think that it's somehow wrong or unnatural, nor should you expect anything different. Suffering must just be embraced as one of those ultimate realities. It's the world that we live in. Here is the thing, though. Even the desires of somebody like Richard Dawkins don't resonate with his worldview. Do you notice the choice of words that Richard Dawkins employs? Blind, pitiless, indifference. Aren't they interesting words to pick? Aren't they the most emotive words to pick? When Richard Dawkins calls the universe blind, isn't he reflecting that he wants somebody to see the suffering that we're enduring? When he calls the universe pitiless, doesn't the very choice of that word reflect the fact that we all long for someone to have pity and to show compassion? And when he chooses the word indifference, it's because deep down, even Richard Dawkins feels as though there should be someone who cares. Look, here's the point. We can talk a good game, a bullish game about nature being red in tooth and claw, but when pain invades our lives, or those that we care about, we long for someone to see the suffering. We long for someone to have compassion on sufferers. We long for somebody to care about the evil of the world. But atheism offers nothing. It can't offer anything. We come from nothing, we go to nothing. Suffering has always been, it will always be, and to hope for anything more is, in the words of Hitchens, sentimentality and self-pity. Now, speaking as a Christian, I have to say the existence of suffering and pain is hard for me to square with my worldview. It is. But I want to suggest that the existence of suffering and pain should prompt all of us to ask some very difficult questions. And many who profess to be atheists, I think, find their position unlivable. That actually the outworkings of what they claim the universe to be like when it comes to suffering makes no sense of how they actually respond when suffering comes. Let me spell this out. Without God, suffering becomes natural. There is absolutely no comfort to offer. And it becomes hopeless. We are merely people that will die, as part of a human race that will die, on a planet that will die, that's all. And so suffering and death have the ultimate end not only in your story, but in the story of humanity. Death wins. There's nothing beyond it. And that makes suffering ultimately hopeless. And hopeless suffering is perhaps the hardest to bear of all. I love it in the novel The Life of Pi. One of the characters puts it like this: when you've suffered such a great deal in life, each additional pain becomes both unbearable and trifling. Look, when we suffer, it might seem reasonable to ditch God, but you have to look this truth in the eye. Without God, you will still suffer. You will still die. It's just your suffering and your death become normal, ultimate realities. And you're robbed of any ultimate hope. Now, a few years ago, Stephen Fry, who, let's remember, is an atheist, generously took the time to write to a fan on the subject of depression. In it, he likens depression to the weather. Here's a quote from the letter. He says this: "Here are some obvious things about the weather. It's real. You can't change it by wishing it away. If it's dark and rainy, it really is dark and rainy, and you can't alter it. It might even be dark and rainy for 2 weeks in a row. But it will be sunny one day. It isn't under one's control as to when the sun will come out, but come out it will, one day. It really is the same with one's moods, I think. The wrong approach is to believe that they are illusions. They are real. Depression, anxiety, listlessness, these are as real as the weather and equally not under one's control. No one's fault. But they will pass. They really will." Now, this is beautiful advice to anybody struggling with mental illness. I wholeheartedly agree. I've got to say, this letter shows me what a thoughtful and kind guy Stephen Fry is in taking the time to write to a fan. But I wonder if you notice what his words of consolation were to this suffering person. Did you hear it? It will be sunny one day. Isn't that a lovely sentiment? But it doesn't make any sort of sense within Stephen Fry's atheistic worldview. See, regardless of whether individual people might get over of individual bouts of mental illness, Stephen Fry doesn't believe that the world ends with sunshine. He lives in an atheistic universe. And so for Stephen Fry, life ends with suffering and death, whether he likes it or not. Now, I don't want to overdo my criticism here of Stephen Fry. This is, after all, a beautiful, beautiful letter, which has been written by a deeply concerned man for one of his friends. I merely want to make this point. Like many atheists, Stephen Fry ends up expressing to people in pain something that is not congruous with his worldview. His optimism is not grounded in what he actually claims to be true. It's as if he sings, "The sun will come out tomorrow," when actually he should be singing, "Que sera, sera." Whatever will be, will be. Just like Christopher Hitchens was actually brave enough to do. And so as a child needs to be lifted on her father's lap in order to slap him in the face, so Stephen Fry needs God to be able to say anything positive to people who are in misery. Stephen Fry is desperate, like many kind atheists I know, to offer comfort and hope. But that comfort and hope does not flow out of his core beliefs. And many other much more logically consistent atheists, like Sartre or Camus or Nietzsche, have come to realize just that. Sunshine does not have the final say in the atheistic universe. The darkness does. And that has left many logically consistent atheists scrambling for hope. Now, here is the point. If nothing else at all, doesn't our experience of living in the world testify to the fact that we hate those things that adversely affect the experience of our lives and those we love, including depression, including mental illness, and ultimately including death? We feel that as if these things have the final say on our lives, that there is no hope at all. And living without hope is surely a dreadful thing. Wouldn't it be amazing to say to the sufferer of mental illness that the shadows really will be chased away, that the light really will come? Wouldn't it be great if the words that Sam offers Frodo were true? It's only passing, this shadow. Even darkness must pass. A new day will come, and when the sun shines, it'll shine out all the clearer. Wouldn't it be great if that sentiment didn't sound too good to be true? Part of the reason I'm a Christian is for exactly this reason. I believe that Jesus makes sense of what we see in the world, including suffering, including pain, and all the rest, and yet offers hope in the midst of it. Because with Jesus, suffering is neither natural nor is it hopeless. First, with Jesus, suffering is not natural. Remember, the Christian claim is that Jesus is the creator God who's come in the flesh, and as one who was called the man of sorrows, he's not immune to suffering. That means that the Christian God is not a passive observer of suffering, but he knows what it's like to suffer himself. On one occasion, one particularly beautiful occasion, we see Jesus going to the tomb of his recently dead friend, Lazarus. And the account tells us that as Jesus arrives on the scene, we're told two things about him: that he is deeply moved in spirit and that he's troubled. And then that Jesus weeps. Here is deep sadness on Jesus' part, but also anger. We know that for ourselves, don't we? I remember going to the graveside of my friend Ben, who was knocked off his bike when I was in sixth form. We feel not only sadness, but also anger. And Jesus is angry at death. He grieves over it as something unnatural. And in the biblical story of the world, that makes perfect sense. There was once a day without suffering and death. There will one day be a day without suffering and death. The experience of suffering and death, which is so common today, is in some sense deeply unnatural. Now, some of you will know that within a matter of minutes, Jesus will raise Lazarus back to life. But even so, he stands at the tombside and he weeps, because death is tragic. Jesus doesn't dare to go and join hands with people and say, hey, it's the circle of life. Jesus is angry. Jesus knows deeply that death should not be. And it is a precious thing to me in my suffering that the Christian God weeps at suffering and at death. So for Jesus, suffering is not natural, nor is it hopeless. It's incredibly precious to me that my God weeps over suffering. He's not immune from it. But surely in a suffering world, we need more than just his tears. If there's to be sunshine in the end, we also need his action. And so we also see that Jesus triumphs over both suffering and ultimately death. Here's how the account describes what happened next at Lazarus' tombside. Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" And the dead man came out, his hands and his feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. The historical accounts tell us that Jesus turned this funeral into a party because he has the power to help. And this isn't the only case of Jesus' power being used in this way. A few weeks later, after raising Lazarus, Jesus rose from his own tomb. Death couldn't hold him. Jesus was never to die again. And the Bible teaches us that in his own death, Jesus took the death of death onto himself. He succumbed to the ultimate suffering himself at the cross, so that when he burst out of the tomb into new life, it was, as one writer put it, he was like the needle piercing the shroud of death and coming out the other side. Jesus comes through suffering and death, and like the needle pulling the thread, he's able to pull you through as well, even your death. There is life with Jesus that cannot be marred by suffering or death. Now, we've come back to the historical claim to Jesus' resurrection a number of times this week, and here it is again. If Jesus rose from the dead, then neither suffering nor death has the final say in the universe, because there is one who can triumph over suffering. There is one who can triumph over death. Jesus has the last say in the universe, not suffering, not even death. And as I've come to suffer in some small ways, less maybe than some of you, I have come to realize that counterintuitive to what it might first seem, I dare not walk away from Jesus in the midst of pain or suffering. Because to do so is only to multiply my problems and to surrender any ultimate hope. But of course, there's one final question that we might legitimately ask, and it's this. If Jesus is so troubled by suffering, and if he does have the power to stop it, then why doesn't he? What about freezing refugees in Syria? What about AIDS? What about bone cancer in seriously ill children? Or think about Lazarus. If he had the power, Jesus could have even stopped Lazarus from dying before he did. And yet the account says that Jesus didn't intervene. Lazarus died. And so we find ourselves asking the question, does Jesus care? If he is the creator, if he is the one true God, does he care? Lazarus and his family were deeply loved by Jesus. And yet Jesus declines to bring a healing. And so if we might put it this way, Jesus allows suffering and death, but only ultimately in order to offer a resurrection. He allows them to have a funeral, but only so that they could one day be more certain of the transformation that Jesus ultimately offered them. So as you read through the New Testament, you will find that Jesus is not committed to merely prettying up this decaying world. He's not committed to just patching up his universe as if he was sticking plasters over the sores. No, rather like his own death, Jesus will take the entire universe down into suffering and death and purge it of all that is wrong. Only one day to raise it to life, transformed, new, and with the absence of suffering and pain and death. And all this means that whilst it's within his power, if you become a Christian, Jesus won't necessarily heal you. He won't necessarily make your life immediately better. He didn't heal Lazarus. And yet Jesus' death on the cross is the absolute proof that he loves you. His example shows that he weeps with you in your pain, and his word guarantees that he is absolutely committed to bringing about a transformation of the universe. But this will come through suffering, and it will come through death. And we can know this because at the cross, God the Son endured the greatest suffering of all. God the Son endured our hell for us. The greatest suffering of all was inflicted on the greatest person of all. And yet through this suffering came resurrection hope just 3 days later. The greatest suffering achieved the greatest triumph. And that means Jesus' death on the cross then is not merely an example of meaningful suffering. It's the entire engine for God, how God deals with this broken, aching world. Jesus takes all of our suffering to the cross, deals with it at its root cause, and then transforms it in himself to a greater glory. If you're suffering here today, I don't know what this looks like in your case. But whatever suffering you are currently undergoing and will undergo in life, let me encourage you to look to the cross and ask yourself, can I trust this God, this suffering God? Does it make more sense to walk through a life of suffering and pain with or without him? And let me say, all of us need to ask this question, because one day all of us will be asked to comfort somebody who is suffering, and all of us will be asked what can give authentic hope. Maybe that will be with dying parents, or a grieving spouse, or someone you've met in acute pain. What will you comfort them with? May I humbly encourage you to consider Jesus. Read an account of Jesus' life. There are people here in the Christian Union who would love to would love to help you to do that. And as you do so, ask these questions. In this world of pain, what evidence is there that Jesus cares? And in a world of pain, what evidence is there that Jesus has something within his power to do something about it? Can he truly offer hope? And you may just find that the objections of Stephen Fry and all the new atheists and each of us can find some sort of resolution in the person and character of Jesus.
Thank you very much, Pete. Do continue to text in your questions while we take them in the next sort of 10 minutes or so. The first one, Pete, is the universe may be blindly and pitilessly indifferent, but what about the people in it? Can't I find comfort in their company, no matter what my beliefs concerning the existence of God?
Can you find comfort in humanity, regardless of your belief in God? Yes, you can find some comfort. You can't find ultimate comfort. You can find some comfort. And what I want to suggest is that when generally we do find comfort from other people, it tends to be in words that don't make sense if you come from an atheistic universe. I have no doubt that the person who received that beautiful letter from Stephen Fry found comfort in it. But that doesn't flow out. It's not authentic to the world that Stephen Fry believes in. And so I've got to say, whilst I think we can find comfort from each other, I believe that the atheistic position of living in the world is completely unlivable. You may well be here and be an atheist, but I would bet your bottom dollar that when you meet suffering people, you find yourself instinctively responding to suffering people in a way that doesn't flow out of your convictions about humanity, about the universe, and the existence of suffering in the world.
Thank you. Short question here, possibly longer answer. How can God allow natural disasters?
I can give a partial answer here. Only a partial answer. It may be that you want to talk a little further about this. The Bible says that there was this day without pain and suffering, but that as humanity rebelled against God, pain entered the world. Now, humanity, according to the Bible, was created as the absolute climax of everything that God made. That we bear more of his image than anything else in the entire universe. And in a sense, we were created to be custodians, stewards over the rest of the universe. Now, the Bible doesn't give a complete answer here. But when humanity rebelled against God, the Bible says that the whole of the universe, every atom in the universe, in somehow was caught up with the brokenness and curse that humanity received from God. And so all sorts of suffering which aren't maybe directly today a result of human rebellion against God, that, there's some suffering which obviously is caused by humans. War, for example. But things like disease, things like natural disasters entered the world at that point as a result of humanity's rebellion against God. Now, ultimately, the same that we've been thinking about applies today as we think about natural disasters. And yet what the Bible would say is, as we look at the universe and we have this instinctive reaction that something is not right, even natural disasters testify to the way in which the universe, as beautiful as it is, also seems to be deeply broken from its very core. And so some of you will know that the Oxford Don, C.S. Lewis, in writing about natural disasters, says that pain is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And in a sense, as I look at the natural disasters of the world, as I see, I've never been in a natural disaster, but as we see the pictures of the earthquakes or the famine or the tsunamis, we can't help feel but something from deep down that there is something fundamentally broken and wrong with the universe. And the Bible would say that is because there is something deeply wrong with the universe. Our desires there aren't deceiving us.
Thank you. We've got a couple of questions on the same theme, and this is along the theme of the idea that we're caring about our suffering, and does that make the claim of God's existence more convincing?
So because we care about suffering, does that make the existence of God?
Yeah, why does that mean there's
Okay. Okay, so sometimes people say to me, look, the fact that we don't like suffering doesn't mean that there's got to be an answer to suffering. And that's, of course that's true. I really hoped that Bournemouth would beat Derby County last night, but the fact it was a 2-2 draw, sometimes we hope for things and we desire them, but that doesn't mean that they're going to have any sort of correspondence in reality. On this, though, there'll be a couple of things to say. One is, as I've said a number of times, I do believe that the atheistic position is unlivable. And that actually, the fact that we find ourselves instinctively caring for suffering people and instinctively weeping as we see pain does point to the fact that deep down we seem to reflect on the fact that suffering is wrong. Even those people like Stephen Fry who claim that they're atheists can't help but write beautiful letters to sufferers. But the other thing is, absolutely right. Just because we want there to be a happy ending to the universe doesn't mean there has to be one. Absolutely right. And so we need to look into the evidence. And particularly, as I've said here, this means looking into the evidence for Jesus, and particularly that means looking into the evidence of whether he really was able to conquer suffering and death. And I believe that evidence is absolutely compelling.
Thank you. We've had loads of questions, and I'm sorry we're not going to get around to all of them. I just want to, as we close, draw your attention to a few things. We've got lunch bars continuing this week. Tomorrow is the idea of a repressed life. Won't Christianity rob me of my freedom? And on Friday, back down in the DSU again, is Christianity actually good news? This evening, for those of you football fans, there's an ex-Premiership football player coming along who's called Linvoy Primus. And if that doesn't score the goal for you, then the talk is on where is God when life falls apart. So continuing along the similar theme. Second thing to say is that there are comment cards on each of your seats. Quite a large-sized one. What we'd really love you to do, whether you've been to this event for the first time or this is your 10th time coming along, just write down any comment about the event. And if you're one of those people who did text in a question or you have more questions, we'd really like for you to write that question down, write your number or your email, and one of the members of the CU will be in touch with you, and we'd love to talk to you about it. So feel free to do that, and you can pop them in at a box in the back. So do take them with you. So finally, just tonight, Linvoy Primus, where is God, where life falls apart? And finally, thank you very much for coming.